You're watching PBS Hawaii, supported by viewers like you. It's not just TV, it's magic. PBS Hawaii, home is here.
Local broadcasts of Insights on PBS Hawaii are made possible by the support of viewers like you. Mahalo, and by Carl Smith Ball, providing legal services throughout Hawaii and the Pacific since 1857, making a positive difference in the communities where we live and work. The results are in for the primary election. We look at the candidates now heading to the general election in November as our panel weighs in on the county, state, and federal races they're keeping their eyes on. Plus, a closer look at our voting trends. Voting by mail has made casting a ballot more convenient, but is it making a difference in Hawaii's voter participation? Join us for a primary election review. Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of Insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Daryl Huff. The votes are in for the primary election. The thing is, there weren't many votes to count. Less than a third of registered voters cast their ballot. We'll talk more about the low turnout, plus a look at the lawmakers that won't be returning to the job next session and what's to come in November. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email or call in your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and the PBS Hawaii YouTube page. Now to our guests. Colin Moore is a public policy analyst and director of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace, as well as an associate professor with UHERO, the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization. Blaze Lovell covers government accountability and ethics as a reporter for Honolulu Civil Beat. Recently, he was part of the inaugural class of the New York Times Local Investigations Fellowship. Ashley Mizuo is Hawaii Public Radio's government reporter. She previously worked as the City Hall reporter at the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. She holds degrees from Loyola University Chicago and the University of Illinois Springfield. And Dan Nicaso is the Capitol Bureau Chief at the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Before reporting in Hawaii, he worked at the Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Examiner, and the San Jose Mercury News. First of all, the big headline of this year was obviously the defeat of Scott Saiki at the State House. Ashley Mizuo, what do you think happened there?
Yeah, I think it was a couple of things. First, I think it came down to, people rejecting that establishment candidate. They view, Speaker Saiki as the establishment and Kim Koku Iwamoto as a newcomer trying to be progressive, come in and change things. And I think people decided that they want to change, and the best way to do that is to vote out the person in charge, which is Speaker Saiki. And so I think it really came down to that. And I also think part of it comes down to, Speaker Saiki refused to, debate Kim Koku Iwamoto publicly, and I think that was also part of it as well. So I think those are the kind of main reasons. Dan
Nicaso, do you think that is the way it played out, or do you think it was more local issues that were involved?
There was some dissatisfaction going back to the last two legislative sessions that I think people do pay attention to, and part of it was the reforms following all the bribery scandals and some of the changes that did and did not come out of the legislature. That district is also very different than the traditional suburban district. There's high-rises, condos, a lot of new people coming in, hard to campaign door to door. And I think there's some senior complexes, but a lot of newcomers, a lot of downtown workers, a lot of young energy. Kind of hard to get a pulse of what's going on. So it might have been a challenge for Scott Saiki to get his messages out.
Colin Moore, what's your read on what happened?
I agree with what's already been said. I mean, I think this was sort of a perfect storm for Saiki. So like Dan and Ashley have said, it's tough to connect with voters in that district because there's so many new voters, a tough district to campaign in, although of course Scott Saiki spent an enormous amount of money on this campaign. But the thing I think that is really going on here is that Saiki, for a lot of people, came to represent the Hawaii State Legislature. As the boss or the speaker, you can't really run away from that. And so I think it was easy for Kim Koko to sort of paint him as the problem, the establishment. I don't think it was anything directly that Scott Saiki did. I'm not sure if voters are following how he voted or what his position on was the issues, on various issues. But I think for a lot of people, he became the symbol of their frustration with the legislature.
You know, Blaze Lovell, one of the things that was going on there, though, is that Saiki had a lot of endorsements from high-powered people. The governor, Senator Schatz were on every one of his brochures. Do you think that helped him or hurt him in the end?
I mean, like Ashley said, you know, that vote was definitely against the establishment, but I'll take a stab at looking at what happened within the district. He lost 2 precincts along the Kaka'aka waterfront that he just barely won in 2022. And, you know, over there, like Dan said, there's lots of condos, lots of high-rises, and lots of condo owners. And as you know, they've been dealing with a lot of issues too, and Kim Koko Iwamoto, some would say successfully, made condo issues an issue in that race.
No, that was a big deal, right? I mean, but the governor, again, tried to help him out with that as much as he could, like literally saying, I'm going to deal with this, and Saiki was at every press conference. The condo issue is rippling out, and do you think, Colin, that that's one of the reasons people were against the legislature this year is because they didn't do anything about that?
I think for some voters, I think Blaze is right. I mean, I think that was a key voting issue for some of them. I think that's going to become an increasingly important issue throughout the state because it's just hitting people's pocketbooks so hard. So I think that was key. But I think in that district, it really was something symbolic. I mean, Kim Koko could run as a change candidate. She was also incredibly well financed. We don't see that many challengers who can bring those sorts of resources to run against an incumbent.
She's personally wealthy.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, you can imagine what would happen if, for example, we went to a system of publicly financed campaigns where
I knew you would get to that quickly.
Hey, I got to plug the program I've been pushing. If every challenger could bring those kind of resources to a race.
I think historically, sorry, Daryl.
Go ahead.
You also have to look back. This is the third showdown between Kim Koko Iwamoto and Scott Saiki. So she's been out there and she's been listening, and she is more progressive. Even though Scott Saiki considers himself progressive, he's certainly more moderate than she is. So I think that might have plugged into this dynamic electorate out there.
So what's going to happen, Ashley, with Scott Saiki gone from the legislature?
Yeah, so they're going to have to decide on the new speaker. Obviously, this is already in progress, even though the official vote won't be until later. They're discussing different people, different names, although the one that keeps coming up is House Majority Leader Nadine Nakamura. She has been the forward-facing person of the House ever since the election. For example, at the Democrats' traditional unity breakfast, she was the person that represented the House. She gave the speeches, she gave the interviews. So it really felt like they were pushing her forward as this is going to be the new speaker. She represents Kauai. She started her career in city planning in Honolulu and has been a representative since 2016.
It'd be a lot of power for Kauai if she becomes the House Speaker and the Senate President's from Kauai, too.
That's true. Yeah.
What do you think, Blaze, about what's going to happen in the House? Do you think the progressives like Iwamoto are going to take power?
I mean, like Ashley mentioned at the Unity Breakfast, we definitely saw all the groups, huddled on that side there. They were already deciding who the next speaker would be.
The body was not even cold yet.
Exactly, and they're already heating up the next one. And, the name we most often heard was Nadine Nakamura, but we were hearing this week that a lot of the progressives were getting iced out of the bigger conversation of who would be in leadership. The thing is, with Iwamoto winning, they still, I don't think, have the numbers to really push the change that a lot of the progressive candidates would like to see in the House.
Now, what else happened across this election? We mentioned in our introduction that 4 incumbents lost their positions. Colin, who else did we see lose their job?
Well, we saw Natalia Hussey-Burdick in Kailua. She lost her job. May Mizuno, who was an appointee, of course, the office manager and wife of John Mizuno. I think some folks were a little bit surprised about that. Ikaika Hussey won that race. He's been campaigning for other positions in that area, but he's a strong campaigner. I mean, I think one way you can explain perhaps this loss is that it doesn't look like May Mizuno campaigned quite as hard.
A lot of this is very local to what happens in those particular districts.
It is. And a lot of it, it's if you get out there and you really knock on all the doors, it can be, you can win. Especially if you're not an incumbent who's been there for years and years and years. I think Sonny Ganadin, who's another incumbent who lost, I think that was a surprise to nearly everyone because I think our sense was he was a fairly popular progressive candidate. But I think the story there is that a challenger campaigned probably harder than he did, and that's a district in Kalihi where you don't get a lot of voter turnout to begin with. So, it can hinge on, a small number of votes. I think there were only 1,400 votes cast in the Democratic primary.
When it comes to the legislature races, Dan, what else did you see? Where else do you see this going?
Well, there is, so Ikaikahasi is considered more progressive. There's
Longtime environmental activist
yes.
and attorney, I think.
And it looks like the people that were in leadership under Scott Saiki are likely to ascend. But there are some, Rep. David Tarnas from the Big Island, who is part of Saiki's leadership. He's going to push recreational legal marijuana again. It hasn't gone anywhere, but maybe the next session it gets some more traction.
Well, then the other thing was all the reforms for government that were being pushed, and Saiki was being blamed for supposedly telling Tarnas we're not doing that. So that could be another area that we could see some movement. Blaze, do you think that we're going to see reform in the legislature without Saiki? I mean, taking for what Colin said, if he's the face of the legislature, that was a big issue.
Well, I mean, I think that's something that we're going to see, right? If the theory was that if Saiki's gone, suddenly all of these progressive reforms would go through. With a new speaker coming in, this will sort of tell us, was it Saiki? Or was it the body majority that was, deciding early on, hey, we don't want to vote on this, don't let this come before us, and Saiki then tells Tarnas, hey, we don't want to take this up.
Actually, let me bring up something else, which is the city and county of Honolulu. It's over already. There's not going to be a single city and county race on the ballot in November.
Yeah.
What do you make of that, Ashley?
I think that is just crazy because it was the mayor was up for re-election. He spent $1.8 million in his campaign against a not competitive race. He really didn't have any really strong challengers, although Chun James did do better than I thought she would, considering she only raised like $10,000. But yeah, and then all of the council races were won outright, even though some of them were a little bit iffy. They came out, Esther Kia'aina and Kaneohe, she won outright as well, even though that was one that we thought maybe could go to a runoff, as well as the open seat that council member Calvin Say has vacated.
Scott Nishimoto got like 79% of the
yeah.
vote. The legislator represented that district. But I mean, it's just like, what happened? No prosecutor was, and then 3 of the council members didn't even have a race.
Which was a little surprising because there was so much anger over that council raise. I mean, you thought there really would be something to campaign on, particularly against maybe Esther Kia'aina, who did take the full raise. I think a lot of voters weren't even aware that you could win outright in the primary. I was talking to some folks today who were asking me, wait, you mean the election is over, that Blangiardi already won in the primary? We don't get another shot at this? I think that took a lot of people by surprise, too.
Well, each county has its own rules. Sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. Either of you guys got a thought about
Well, going back to both the 3 county prosecutors had no challengers, including Steve Alm, who, going back to the point I made about legalized recreational marijuana coming back, he was the big force against it last session. So if it comes up again, that would be interesting. You've got a prosecutor in Steve Alm who had no opposition, no reason.
Probably the best county race we had was the Big Island mayor's race.
Right.
Blaze, how do you handicap that one going into the general?
Right. I mean, you have Mayor Mitch Roth up against Kimo Alameda, who's, criticized the mayor over, hazard pay for union workers. That's how he picked up endorsements from UPW and HGEA. They used to support Mayor Roth, but, sort of ditched him over that issue. That's, I think, like the biggest thing that's opened him up politically to, give any opponent a sort of opening. And I think Kimo Alameda's been taking advantage of that.
Well, he's also, seems like he's quite popular in his own right.
He's a charismatic guy. He reminds me a little of Billy Kanoy. I mean, I think he's a strong campaigner. He got out early, too. I remember being over there in Hilo in June, and there were probably 100 people already sign waving for Kimo Alameda. I think Mayor Roth was caught a little off guard in this race.
Our reporter said when you get to Hilo and the Big Island, the Alameda signs are everywhere. and he's got a fair amount of money. Do you think he's going to win, Ash? You think?
Well, I think he definitely probably has a chance. I mean, when you're looking at where he's at, he is also the leader of the Hawaii Island Fentanyl Task Force, which is a really big, example out there of how you can deal with these overdoses. They have been out in the community for a while now, hosting all of these different types of events. So that just gives even more publicity. And on top of that, that same task force that he leads is being kind of modeled throughout in each county. And so I think that also probably helps with campaign purposes, just being out in the community, meeting a lot of people, especially in this vulnerable situation. It
was hard to campaign at the beginning, and it's big, but they're also historically very feisty with their mayors, right? It's like, I don't know exactly why, but we've seen some really shocking mayor races in the past. I didn't think that, I hadn't heard that Mayor Roth had done anything politically wrong, but from what you're mentioning, Blaze, there probably were a couple of political missteps, but he's his own guy.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, but union almost across the board there, you have a lot of old union guys and union gals, but Hilo, Kona, it's a historically strong union town, I think.
Okay, so let's move on. Some of the other races that we haven't yet talked about are the general election races that we're heading into, and the one that jumps out to me is kind of the fun race where Clayton He lost. Let me ask, what do you guys think about Clayton He getting essentially trounced?
It was pretty surprising. I mean, he spent like $90,000 on that
all over TV,
on those TV ads. People know him from being in the Senate for so long, and I think one of the theories out there was that sort of worked more against him than helped him. I mean, if you recall, he's the guy that gutted the shield law for journalists, which sort of turned the media against him at that time. I think with all of the different environmental concerns going on in the North Shore, with the wind turbines, with this new development coming up at Turtle Bay, Ben Schaefer, who beat him, has sort of been involved a lot with a lot of those different movements. You could sort of see
if you saw the
like
people behind him during the election coverage, there was a lot of longtime local activists standing behind him in that.
Exactly.
It would have been an interesting general to have Clayton He, a diehard Democrat, going up against the incumbent Brenton Awa, new generation of Hawaiians, a Republican.
When Brenton Awa is a new generation of politician.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
What do you guys think of him and his chances? I mean, and his attitude toward campaigning at all, Ash?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely a vulnerable seat because I think on top of him already being only one of two Republicans in the Senate, they themselves are not aligned necessarily. And I think that was kind of an interesting thing that I noticed with the Republican Party across the board is they are not united in the way that the Democrats are. And because of that, I think that it works against them because they don't have as many people to coalesce around them. But in the end, I mean, Brenton Awa is a very charismatic person. He has a strong social media presence. And I think people do like that he continuously votes no to a lot of different proposals at the legislature, especially ones that people might deem more frivolous, like Kimchi Day, things like that. And so I think because of that, he's really made a name for himself in the legislature, which could help him in the race, but also works against him in other ways.
It's a hard district to work, though. You've got, it stretches from Kaneohe to Waialua. Kaneohe tends to be Democrat, Asian. You get up from Kuhuku side, it's a lot of not Republican, but conservative Pacific Islanders. And you get up to North Shore, you can go, it's a coin toss. But hats off to him. But going back to your Clayton He point, though, there were a couple of names, May Mizuno that Colin mentioned, Ken Inouye, first timer, but his dad's Dan Inouye.
Taken as probably as a traditional type candidate.
Yeah, but the name alone wasn't enough. But then you've got Scott Nishimoto, who spent a career in the legislature, winning in a landslide to the council. So
it's really hard to read the electorate out of this election.
Right.
Maybe it was because there were so few of them. We're going to get the voter turnout in a minute. I just want to bounce one other thing. So in the Republican caucus, you had this weird thing where they have ostracized, or she has ostracized, Kadani Souza, who is the only real moderate, or the most moderate Republican in the House caucus, which is only like 6 people, 6 or 7, depending, And so she had a very strong competitor who was endorsed by the rest of the Republican caucus, but she won pretty easily. What is the future of the Republican Party? You know, we've got a bunch of people, Colin, maybe you could go through them, that are facing new challenges in this election, newcomers, only just elected 2 years ago. What do you think is going to be the status of the Republican caucus after this election?
I think that's the most interesting question about the general election. So you have Elijah Pierrick, who's going to face Corey Rosenlee, who's probably best known for being head of HSTA for several years. I think that could go either way.
I was shocked that he lost 2 years ago.
I was shocked that he lost as well. I mean, so I don't think anyone was predicting that Pierrick would win 2 years ago. He's been a bit of a controversial figure. I mean, he's definitely, I mean, he comes, I believe he's a evangelical minister. He certainly comes from that community, that background, a strong community in the district. But you know, he's taken some fairly controversial positions during his time in office. Corey Rosenlee, I mean, I think he's obviously going to lean on the union connections there. I think I can't predict who's going to end up winning that race, but that's one to watch.
They all have challenges except for Kanani Souza.
They all have challengers except for Kanani Souza.
Yeah, that's the interesting part is the Republican Party's been working really hard to recruit candidates, and that.
But there's all this infighting that undermines their position. I think the one thing to think about is so we're going to see much more turnout in the general election, right, in November, because everyone wants to vote for president. Now, I tend to think that that's probably going to help the Republicans just a bit. I think the Trump voters are going to turn out, even though they, I think, understand that Hawaii is extremely unlikely to go for Trump. They're going to want to turn out. And I think that's going to help the Republicans in some of these districts because they're going to see high turnout for Republicans, and that might just be enough to put them over the edge. But I think all of these Republicans, with a few exceptions, especially the newly elected Republicans, they're going to have to really fight for their seats.
You know, I've got a couple of questions here that are kind of along the same line, you know, try and reading voter sentiment as it changes. And in the context I'll put these questions in is what just happened with the Democratic Party nationally, where Biden left, in comes Kamala Harris, and all of a sudden you've got what seems like a tremendous amount of excitement among the progressive parts of the Democratic Party. And so now, you know, Mike from the Big Island, this is 2024. It's a new world. The old school Democrat machine is not connecting with the people anymore. Old guard Democrats are too worried about collecting tourism taxes to address what the people of Hawaii need. And that's sort of a, you know, again, progressive candidates. Why would the Psyche Coalition in the House not read the writing on the wall with him losing? Seems risky to continue to ice out the younger, more progressive lawmakers that could come to bite them. Do you think we're going to see a more progressive shift given nationally what's going on? Dan, you're nodding.
I hope, and I think we're going to see a whole new generation of younger voters in Hawaii, but across the country, excited about the Democratic ticket. You know, we've seen this before in prior generations, just some candidate just galvanizes all this good feeling. That would be exciting for voter turnout, but also to answer the question you got, when you spend a fair amount of time in the legislature and you ascend to leadership, it's hard to then say, well, I think it's smarter politically to include other people, you know, young progressives. I think that is better.
Liz, how have progressives been treated in our legislature?
I mean, with the overall with the election, I don't know that the electorate, the people voting, are becoming more progressive. You know, it was a real mixed bag. Sonny Gannon, a progressive, lost. Natalia Hussey-Burdick, a progressive, lost. Ikaika Hussey, who is a progressive, won. So across the board, it's kind of been like a mix. But you know, in the House, like I said earlier, the progressives still make up a relatively small faction. At most, they've gotten maybe, you know, 11. Maybe a bit more if we're being generous, but you know, that's not 26, that's not 46, which is what, you know, the number of Democrats they have in the House. So, you know, if you're part of the Psyche / Nakamura coalition and you've already got the votes, you know, there's not, you might not be incentivized, I guess, to include them in a lot of the conversations.
But I think the question, and I'll let Ash answer this, is also about reading the writing on the wall, which is about the future. Right?
Yeah, I think that, you know, had the presidential election changed in the way that, you know, Vice President Kamala Harris is now the nominee, I think had that happened earlier on, I think maybe more progressives would have been excited about voting by progressives, I mean younger people, because I think generally speaking there was kind of an apathy through this entire election, not just because of our local elections being kind of lackluster, but also the national one being incredibly lackluster as well. And so I think, the writing on the wall is going to depend on, how this presidential election shakes out. I think if, Vice President Kamala Harris does beat former President Donald Trump, I think that'll signal to progressives that, it's working. And
it's a new day.
Yeah, but I think if not, then that kind of, I think, sets people back a little and maybe might dampen that that sentiment.
What do you think, Colin, about the big picture in that way?
So I agree with everything that's been said. I do think that one race we haven't talked about does maybe give you a little indication of what we might see in the future. So this was District 20. This was Bert Kobayashi's old seat. And Tina Grandinetti, who's another progressive, someone very close to Amy Peruso, she won, and she won by a lot. So Kevin Wong, who was one of the other candidates, endorsed, he had a lot of the big endorsements, HGEA. He was endorsed by Bert Kobayashi. He didn't perform nearly as well as people thought. And I think that might give some indication that, at least for some of these districts that are, hardly hotbeds of left-wing activism, running as a progressive, running as a change candidate can be quite successful. The other thing I'll say about the progressives and what I expect might begin to happen in the legislature is I think they're going to become a little more aggressive. Some of the younger progressives who've been elected, like Tina Grandinetti, like Ikaika Hussey, are pretty connected to movement politics here. I mean, they are not afraid to get out and mobilize people to push their positions. They really are, they come from an activist background.
Community organization.
Community organizing background. So I don't think they're going to necessarily play an insider game. I think you're going to see them mobilize folks a lot more to come down and put more pressure on the establishment legislators. And I think they're going to do everything they can to extract absolutely every favor during the speaker election.
Okay, I got an interesting comment. Ann in Makiki. I know an Ann from Makiki. I don't think it's her. Caller says she didn't vote for Blangiardi because of how he has conducted himself as a leader. She hopes that the number of votes against him has sent a message. There wasn't any public forum. There wasn't any chance to really see these candidates, but they still got a fair number of votes. Yash?
Yeah. And I think with Mayor Blangiardi, one thing I've been thinking about why he didn't necessarily have such a challenger and something that seemed like someone would step up and run against him was maybe it was just because he had raised so much money. So if you're coming in as a candidate and you look at that, you're looking at the $1.8 million or whatever, you're just thinking, how am I ever going to raise that amount of money to beat him? And especially since it's his second term, he's already at an advantage because he's an incumbent. And so I think maybe in the upcoming election, maybe we'll see more competitiveness around that. But yeah.
Anybody else?
There is a economic connection between what Colin was talking about, activism and community organizing and voter turnout, which is that I had an interesting conversation with Senator Jarrett Keohokalole of represents Kaneohe and Kailua, and he said homeowners vote, renters tend not to. And so as our home ownership rates decline, so does voter turnout. It's his theory. And he says he's been campaigning a lot of years, and he said it's clear to him.
That's a very interesting point.
Yeah. And so now we've got this housing crisis, right? It's exacerbated.
It's just it's about who is vested in the system and who feels like the system serves them.
Right. And so I think there is a nexus of affordable housing, outrage over what's happening, the exodus of people leaving Hawaii, and some new blood, not a wave of new blood, but it might be exciting this session.
So a couple people indicate they're quite distressed about the lack of turnout, but it's technical questions, both of them. Could the low voter turnout be attributed to the lack of places to vote? I believe that here on the Big Island there are only 2 places to vote in person, one in Hilo, one in Kona. Also, one had to go there on a Saturday. I think that you could go earlier, but that's one turnout question. We had the lowest voter turnout, and with mailing out ballots, how many of the ballots mailed out are stale, whether it's because the person doesn't live or died. So it's sort of like, no, maybe the number is skewed by the fact that they mail out all these ballots. I guess that's the question. That's Tim from Kamuki. But let's talk about voter turnout. I mean, are there technical reasons people aren't turning out, or is it just out and out not wanting to vote?
I think that maybe the answer might be in the general election turnout, because then you will see whether people are generally more energized because it's a presidential election, and so in theory, like, a lot more people will come out and vote. In 2020, 51% of people voted in the primary, and then turnout was 69% in the general presidential election. And so I think when we go back and compare those numbers, that's how you'll be able to tell whether it was the lackluster campaign or if it was other factors.
So there was 32.1% voter turnout, which is low. Interestingly, we have 839,000 registered voters. So people register to vote, they just don't vote.
Don't you register when you get a driver's license?
Well, then
now?
it's very easy to do, just like mail-in. And we had 269,912 total votes cast. Of those, 264,929 were cast by mail-in. And in person was only 4,900.
It seems like mail-in is popular.
Yeah, so people are getting the ballots. If if there's a problem, you can mess up your ballot and take it to a voter service center.
So Colin and Blaze, what do you think is?
Well, I mean, I think the caller raises an interesting question, which is, are we just not purging the number of registered voters quickly enough, and so we're getting a number that doesn't really
technical, statistical
accurately reflected? I think there's there's certainly a little bit of truth to that, probably. Actually, it's sort of fascinating to me. If you look at the number of actual votes in Hawaii primaries, it's been about 300,000 votes since 1978. I mean, the same number of votes have been cast for over 40 years. There are ways that political scientists can model this statistically.
I mean, the same number of votes have been cast pretty consistently?
Almost, yeah.
About so, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If you just look at the absolute number of votes cast, it's been pretty consistent, just around 300,000, right, Blaze, for well over 40
years. And our population
years.
hasn't changed all that much in a while.
But I mean, it's certainly gone up since,
It's been going down recently.
But you're right. But what I was going to say is that you can model this statistically. Some political scientists have done this. If you do that, our voter turnout looks like it goes up a little bit. So this measures the voting eligible population, so the number of people over 18 who are citizens. So the caller's onto something a little bit, but even if you do that, even if you try to correct for that, statistically, you still get a pretty low vote.
And it doesn't take a statistic to get a sense that everybody was just really bored with this election.
Yeah.
Blaze, where do you think the problem is?
I mean, that's what I think was behind it. There was generally a lack of, candidates who could beat the incumbents, and there was just a general lack of candidates total. I mean, we had the least candidates run in this election than we have in at least the last decade. There's a couple reasons. One is people look at these incumbents with their campaign war chest and they think, how am I ever going to beat them? Campaigning's gotten way more expensive in Hawaii. Now senators, council members, they're spending between $80,000 and $100,000 per election. And that's a lot of money, since from back in the day when you could get auntie, uncle, some friends donate to you and you run everything yourself. There's a big sea change there. But even in the competitive races, we saw turnout drop. The Psyche district, in this year there was about 35% turnout. 2 years ago it was closer to 40.
Well, 2 years ago it was a governor's race with a very hot Democratic primary. It'd be interesting to see whether this year, with a general election having a presidential race, whether things sort of flip around again. Because you're still the same people are going to be registered. The same people are going to get their mail-in ballots. It'd be fun to see what happens.
I did want to add that not this election, but the upcoming one, the state has enrolled in this ERIC system, which is data sharing between several different states, and that's supposed to be an easier way for them to clear out voter records if you're registered in 2 places. Currently, the process is a little taxing and long, and I think that ERIC system is supposed to streamline some of that, and so maybe we'll see a lot more voter clearouts.
We did get my daughter's ballot in the mail. She lives in Washington State. I have to say, it was a little tempting. Didn't do anything. But it's like, oh, that's great. It is a felony, right? It is a felony.
Yes, it is.
Remember, it's a felony, and I'm not going to commit no felony.
Suddenly social media went ablaze.
Yeah, I'm not young enough to commit felonies for fun anymore. Okay, so a couple more voter turnout questions. What about incentives for voters, like a gift card or a discount on a county service? Brian and Kawaki.
I say
not a lot.
maybe
of
an I voted sticker.
Sure, I voted sticker.
Yeah.
I remember that. Used to go, show up.
I
and they
think
give
you
you
might
a-
still get one
I think we
if
got
you
pins 2 years
go.
ago.
I'm not sure actually. And I think also going back to one of the other comments that said that there weren't that many polling places, I think like we also need to point out that there are a lot of drop boxes for your mail-in ballot. So if you didn't feel like you wanted to mail in your ballot, which I didn't because I waited till the last minute as always, you could just drop it off at your whatever.
There was also a
mailbox.
theory that because the primary was held on a Saturday, that might have helped suppress vote.
But I mean, less than 4,000 people voted on this. You know, in
But you would
person,
also
right?
think that maybe it would help because you're not like running from your office trying to get there. Like you have all day on a weekend. I could see it argued both ways, I guess. Yeah.
I remember the old days too, when the same complaint back in the day when everybody had to vote in person, everybody had to do it the day of the election, and people say they lost the election because it rained.
Yeah.
That was common. That happened. Frank Fosse used to say, if the weather's bad or there's a UH football game, I'm going to lose.
Well, I'm going to give reason for Ashley to make fun of me again, but I still remember going into the voting booth with my mom when I'm, hanging on her skirt.
Yeah, I
and
did
watching her
that
vote.
too.
And you stand in line and you talk to your
You don't have to be
neighbors
that
about
old.
this, that, and the other
Yeah.
thing. And, I do miss that part of it.
But just since we're chatting about it, the efficiency now is so dramatic. We don't have to sit there on election night waiting for one printout after another. We don't have to wait for them to drive ballots, although they did have to drive ballots from Kona to Hilo this year. But boom, the printout comes out at 7 o'clock, and that election is over.
Yep.
And then the next printout's 4,000. And they're all the election workers are sitting there in the state capitol waiting for the next thing. It's so much more efficient. I'm sure it's way cheaper. Maybe they could use that money for something else. Colin?
Well, I'll plug what I've been
tee them
plugging
right
for
up.
a while, which is that we can't do anything to make it easier to vote, I don't think. I mean, we have pretty much made all the infrastructure technology changes to make it as easy as possible for folks to vote. But I just want to echo what Blaze said, is that I think we're not seeing as many candidates, maybe a little bit because people are worried about exposure on social media, but I think a lot because they just don't think they can raise that kind of money. They don't think they can ask their friends for that kind of money because working families are struggling so much to get by. So how might you solve that problem? Well, you go back to a solution the state had in 1978, which is you create a robust system of public financing.
We had that in 1978.
It was part of the CONCON. So it came out of the CONCON, I should say. It didn't exist in 1978.
Oh, the one that we have now.
The one that we have now, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But this would be, I think what has been proposed over the years is a much more robust program, and it's died in the legislature the last few sessions, but it would provide really what amounts to a grant for folks to run for.
And it's substantial.
Yeah, it is quite substantial. I mean, the money would be enough for anyone to run a very competitive campaign.
I've talked to a fair number of folks that are interested in the democratic process for whom fundraising is so distasteful, especially from rural communities.
Even a lot of politicians don't like to have to raise money.
I don't think I've ever known a politician who liked to raise money. I mean, it is the great wet blanket in our political system.
Yeah.
I will say this election commission has made a decision to allow candidates to use some of their campaign funds for childcare purposes, which some candidates have said has kind of opened the door for caregivers or mothers to use those, or fathers to use that fund to take care of their kids so that they can actually go door to door and campaign. I spoke to a candidate who is a single mother, and she said, what am I supposed to do with my kids when I need to campaign? And if you don't have childcare, then
Hand them a
you
sign.
can't do that. Or if they're very young children.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that it's about bringing down those barriers to allow more candidates to enter the race.
Blaze, what do you think about the public financing idea?
I mean, it's been brought up a few times in the legislature. With the incumbent Democrats, I feel like a lot of them think it's just going to be a handout to other Republican candidates that could come up and then maybe beat them, and that's maybe why it keeps dying. The other argument, not necessarily argument, but even people who support it sort of bring this up too, is the cost of it. I think they said something like $35 million, and
It's a fair
so
chunk
there's
of
some
change, yeah.
heartburn sometimes over the cost, but you know.
It's much better give a big tax cut so that you can help your incumbency by pointing to it. I was part of Dan's voter apathy article, and I spoke about the Hawaiian Kingdom, and we are still considered recognized as people of the Hawaiian Kingdom, so I can't vote. Is there disenchantment with politics out of a significant segment of the population? That, like, is that another reason in Hawaii we might not have this?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to like family and friends who don't vote, that's what they say is like, you know, why vote? Because nothing's gonna change. There's definitely that feeling out there.
People don't vote because nothing ever changes. The politicians talk, and taxes, cost of living, and lack of housing rises every year, and the politicians don't do anything to help with real issues. I get the feeling that that was a little more colorful quote before they rewrote it.
I actually sent that in, Daryl.
It was your punch. But I mean, are we seeing just sort of a, you know, air coming out of our democratic system if this few people are voting? That's kind of a depressing thought, but I mean, really, Ashley, you're the young one here.
Hey, Blaze and I are the same age, first of all.
But I mean, is the next generation going to save us again?
Well, that's why, I'm sorry, Ashley, I know I asked you, but that's why I'm excited by the potential that November could mobilize younger folks to get excited to vote in that election, and it might spill over because it does take some effort. Some people don't feel like they're akamai enough to vote because they don't want to cast the wrong vote. So it does take some effort, but you know, just showing up is part of it. Sorry, Ashley.
I was going to say, I think too, because we're in Hawaii, people feel removed from, you know, the national conversation with politics. And so I think here, I get sometimes comments like, oh, it's too divisive, or like, I don't know if I want to, you know, participate in that because I don't know who to vote for. And so I think some of it comes down to separating, you know, local and state politics and how that affects you directly from, you know, the national politics that we've come to see be, you know, very divisive and very nasty. And I think when candidates are able to demonstrate to voters, this means, you know, better streets or less potholes or, you know, lower property taxes or things that people can contextualize. Those are the candidates that do really well. And then the ones that, you know, rely a little bit more on the national movement of things, I think they see less turnout in Hawaii.
One quick question, Stacy, do you think voter turnout would increase if we implemented a more robust civics curriculum in our public schools? I've heard a lot of people talking about that in the last couple of years.
I would say, yeah, 100%.
Why do you say that?
Just because I think a lot of people, either they forget or they didn't learn, or, you know, through the years, there's so much to worry about, you know, general civics of, you know, how everything works. It just kind of gets lost in the mix. And I think that's also why people don't vote. You know, I sometimes have people asking me, you know, oh, are we voting for mayor or governor, and what's the difference? And so, yeah, I think education is really helpful.
You know, I've been on a couple of task forces from the DOE to improve civic education. And, you know, the way contemporary educators sort of think about this is that learning the nuts and bolts is important, you know, learning the Constitution, that's important, but also what they call civic skills and dispositions. You know, that means getting students comfortable with perhaps testifying or writing a letter to the editor or engaging in these kind of civic debates. So I think the DOE, and there's actually relatively new DOE standards that have come out that embrace all of that. The trouble is, it's crowded out often by the time spent on language arts, on math, because those are the things that are tested. There's only one social studies specialist for the entire DOE that's in charge of professional development. I think there's been a couple of proposals over the last couple of years to provide more funding so that they can create a more robust civics curriculum, because when you talk to teachers, a lot of them say, I'd be happy to do more civics education, but we don't really have that kind of professional development or a material to implement. And so some of it is a funding issue.
Gentlemen?
When I was in high school, eons ago apparently, you know, I mean, I remember the civics class was like, it was only a semester long, and we mostly learned about, you know, Congress and
how a bill becomes a law.
Yeah, I'm just a bill. Oh, I'm only
you remember
a
that.
bill. Yeah, Schoolhouse Rock stuff. But I don't remember learning, you know, what Mufi Hanneman's job was, or that there was a city council that's going to be, you know, fixing or not fixing my road.
Well, you know what? I'll pitch it on here because I'm literally the oldest one here. I think Dan and I are competing a little bit.
Easy.
But I remember being in school during the Vietnam War, and our social studies classes were vigorous in terms of debating the issues and the future, and it was crazy anxiety and conflict. But now everyone's afraid to bring that into a classroom. You know, do you see that? Go ahead.
We had a mock trial when I was in school about the My Lai massacre. And fast forward all these years later, I'm reading Lieutenant Calley's obit at age 80. And I'm like, how young was he?
But I mean, it was just a different time.
Yeah,
you know,
but we would
people were
discuss
marching in the streets, and you know, so it was just there was more engagement in general. Colin, are educators afraid to bring actual debate over political issues into classrooms? I know around the country, you let kids talk about, you know, transgender rights or abortion in school, and some parent is going to go take you up with a school board.
I think there are some educators who are a little more cautious than they would have been in the past. I think students are a little less willing to kind of engage in debate than they were in the past. So I think both of those things are going on. But I have talked to some educators who are a little nervous about bringing controversial topics into the class.
It takes skill to manage a conversation like that. Right?
But there is a generation of younger voting age people who are active.
These wonderful kids on the climate change lawsuit.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I mean, go with that.
Yeah, the climate change lawsuit, the Navahine climate change lawsuit. You know, you see young kids from, I think the youngest one is like 8 or 9 years old involved in this. And from there all the way up to people who are, you know, starting college have, you know, sued because they feel like, you know, we're not doing enough to prevent climate change, and we're not implementing these energy goals and all of these things that we need to do to save our climate from exploding, basically. And so, you know, I think that there is a generation that's active. I just don't think it's active in the same way because there are just so many different variables that you have to worry about now that you didn't before. But I think that people are just as energized. It's just
but
in a
they
different
see
way.
the relationship between getting involved and getting results. And that's a huge step to voting, number one. But, you know, when I was a kid growing up in San Jose, the mayor, her story was she wanted to get a stop sign in her neighborhood for her kids. And next thing you know, she's testifying and becomes the mayor, yeah.
Yeah, but let me ask, sorry, Blaze, the Native Hawaiian issues, I mean, there's a huge groundswell there as well that also is connected into the environment and a lot of other sustainability and so on. You see that happening too, young Native Hawaiian voters in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'll point out first is that, you know, Native Hawaiians and the Native Hawaiian vote, it's not a monolith. You know, there's a lot of different stratas within that population that might go, you know, different ways. I think we saw that with Governor Green's election against Kaikahele. But you know, it's definitely mobilized certain populations. The wind turbine protests up in Kahuku, Mauna Kea, even if it didn't result in tons of different candidates, you know, it has resulted in more people either running for office or now sitting on some of these commissions where they can make a difference.
And what I've also noticed, though, in Native Hawaiian issues, there is a commonality, particularly towards environmental stewardship, sustainability, responsibility to land, the water.
And tourism, which is
a big attitude
issue.
about tourism, right. A quick question from Eric in Kailua. How important is the youth vote to either party? Do young people nowadays vote for parties or candidates or for issues? Is a growing youth movement good or bad for anybody in particular? You guys want to try that one? Ashley, you're thinking about it. I can see you.
I think it's kind of important to look at, again, like youth vote is not a monolith. I tend to think that I see more progressive younger people, particularly in Hawaii. But that's not to say that they vote for Democrats, because I don't think that young people are really excited about any particular political party. I think it does come down often to the issues or how people are voting, the types of, policy that they're putting forth. And I think that, environment is a really important one for young people. They see, climate change happening and what our future might look like. And I think that that does energize them, and that's something that's really important to younger people.
At the national level, I think the youth vote is going to be tremendously important in the presidential election. If you look at the voters that Biden was hemorrhaging before he dropped out, it was 18 to 25. I mean, he was losing those across the board. Of course, overall, those still tend to be Democratic voters, but a lot of those younger people were moving into the Trump camp. What has really changed with Harris's candidacy is a lot of them have come back to the Democrats. And so, young voters tend to be relatively disengaged. I think often for them the question is whether or not they turn out or don't turn out. But at the national level, I think one of the reasons you're seeing Harris's numbers improve so much is because she's won back or excited a lot of those younger voters.
One of the big challenges she's going to face next week at the National Convention is threading the needle between the Palestinian sympathizer young people and not alienating them. That's no easy solution. She's going to have to message on that pretty delicately, and that's a youth vote.
So I've got 3 questions that go back to the voter turnout thing, and I'm going to turn this on the media because 4 of the 5 of us are employed by media organization. Comment, low voter turnout might be due to people procrastinating, sending in their mail-in ballots, and realizing on election day it was too late. Election day needs to be more publicized. In past elections, I got a lot of materials in my mailbox, printouts, and candidates, lots of candidates on TV. This year, I saw very little of candidates on TV. I barely even realized we had a primary by the time it came and went. That's Linda from Pearl City. I didn't vote for many of the races on my ballot because I didn't know anything about the candidates, and there wasn't any easily accessible information about them. Calling for Pearl City. Is the media, to a certain extent, are we seeing a lot less coverage of politics in the local media?
They can go to civilbeat.org to read about the candidates.
Well, I was telling you before we went on the show that I was on Maui last week covering the anniversary of the fires, and I wrote 3 stories on the election while I was in Maui covering the fires. So,
but that's a week before the election. In the old days, you might be writing those stories several times, right? I mean,
I would also say I kept hearing before the primary that Democratic candidates, both young and incumbents and newcomers, had ground strategies for going door to door. I'm curious whether that's a universe, or whether people actually saw that. Not just getting something in the mail, but getting a candidate knocking on the door and talking stories.
Colin, you're not employed by any particular media organization. So what do you think? Do you think that have you seen a real reduction in political coverage in local media?
Yes, but I don't think it's the fault of the media. I think what we're seeing here locally is the fact that local news organizations have a harder and harder time employing the number of journalists you would need to provide that sort of robust coverage. And so as a result, there's just less time. There's fewer reporters out there covering the candidates. I also say that I think a lot of candidates dodge the media. I mean, there's many instances of that on this very program, for example, where incumbents and others decided they didn't want to appear in this sort of forum, and that doesn't help educate the voters. It might be the right strategic move, but it's not the right civic move.
Are you seeing that too, Ashley Blaze, that sometimes candidates don't want to do media, they want to do their campaigns within their own place?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I feel like a lot of the times you're like following up on this. Oh, just wanted to follow up on my email from the other day, and then calling them up on their phone and then they don't answer. And if they don't want to talk to you, it's like, what are you supposed to, they don't want to talk to you. And so, yeah, I think it's that, and as like Colin said, there's just less journalists here in the island. So yeah.
Blaze, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I remember 2 years ago during the governor's race when BJ Penn was running, he refused to do an interview with anyone at Civil Beat because, I forgot the reasons, but something, we're traditional mainstream media, and our strategy is going to be to reach voters directly on Instagram or something like that.
Well, that was his campaign, and we at the point is now we managed to get him to show up for one debate, and it was very cute. Him and Duke Iona, he called him Uncle. It was all fine, but yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of politicians now just figure I've got a direct route to voters. I don't need the free media anymore.
Yeah, I mean, why submit yourself to tough questions?
But also, we go back. There were very few highly competitive races and whose responsibility is for getting the word out about those races when they're not very interesting.
And it is part of human nature. If you're reading a story in May about an August 10 primary, I think you're thinking, well, I don't need to really immerse myself until we get closer to it. And, you know, it's part of that whole wanting to get engaged early and educate yourself versus, well, I have 3 months to really kind of figure it out.
So, Colin Moore, I'll let you have the last word. What should we look forward to most in the general election, other than the presidential election? What do you think is going to be the most fun locally?
See if Mitch Roth wins re-election. That's number one, and see how these Republicans perform.
You need to talk longer. No, no. Go ahead, Ashley. What are you going to be watching for? What are you excited about the general election?
Yeah, I think I'm definitely going to be watching the seats on the west side of Oahu. I think that they're vulnerable both ways, and I'm not sure which way they're going to turn out, so I'm definitely going to be watching those.
Blaze, any other things we should focus on?
Yeah, the Leeward Oahu races. We'll also be watching the South Maui race between Kelly King and Tom Cook. That could decide the power balance on the Maui Council.
Yeah, you were just on Maui. What do you think the politics are like on Maui after this fire?
I think everybody's under pressure to find out what happens next. You know, there was definitely...
Actually, we've run out of time. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, all of you folks at home, for joining us tonight. And we thank our guests, political analyst Colin Moore and Ashley Mizuo from Hawaii Public Radio, Blaze Lovell from Honolulu Civil Beat, and Dan Nicaso from the Honolulu Star Advertiser. Next week, we're back to sitting down with candidates, this time featuring candidates for Maui County Council, specifically the districts of South Maui and Molokai. Please join us then. I'm Daryl Huff for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Aloha. Sorry about that.
Local broadcasts of Insights on PBS Hawaii are made possible by the support of viewers like you. Mahalo.